Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. You're with Cameron Murray. Today, a special guest to reflect on, can you believe it, 5 years since the Corona Panic Debacle. A good friend of mine, Professor Paul Frijters, joins us, and he was one of the earliest people calling out the panic online. So today is a chance for us to reflect on what happened, what we've learnt, how we use expertise or misuse expertise, and what we can all do about it to improve society. So, Paul, thanks very much for coming on.
It's great to be on the show, Cameron, and it's lovely to see this podcast of yours flourishing.
Thanks so much. Well, maybe the best place to start is to let you introduce yourself to the audience who might not know you. They might know your name because you were my PhD supervisor at UQ now 10 years ago plus, and we co-wrote a book on grey corruption together. But maybe a brief introduction of your economic story that allowed you to perhaps be quite insightful early on during coronavirus.
So I'm born and raised in a Dutch Anglo family, father Dutch, mother English, and I came to Australia in 2001 for a period of about 15 to 16 years. It was a wonderful period. We made a lot of friends. I was at the University of Melbourne, Australian National University, Queensland University of Technology, University of Queensland, and I was for 10 years a professor in health economics there, and also very heavily involved in cost-benefit analysis on well-being, which sort of specializes, if you like, in a broad view of society and asks of very complicated policies. Okay, what are the main beneficiaries? Who are the main losers? And what roughly is the balance between the costs and the benefits of something big? And that is exactly the expertise, which of course was sort of pivotal at the start of the coronavirus, because we were talking about very difficult areas with lots of different effects on people, like school closures. It's not just about viruses going through school grounds, but it's also about children learning. It's about communities being disrupted. It's about mental health, of increased loneliness. There's lots and lots of different effects. And so the expertise that I partly gained in Australia, and then also for 5 years at the London School of Economics, where I headed their well-being program, and I was instrumental in developing these methodologies for the UK government and now also for other governments, that sort of helped me, as it were, develop a broad view of how things go. And the judgment that I made and you made at the start of the coronavirus campaign was actually also made by quite a few treasuries and departments of economics inside governments who have a similar role of trying to sort of figure out, okay, what are the costs and benefits going to be from something as draconian and dramatic as lockdowns or forced vaccinations. And they too came to the conclusion, oh my God, this is going to cost way more lives than it will save. But they were shouted down by governments and by media. And so, these reports exist. They can be found online if you look for them. And we've, of course, alerted people to them in papers and this and that. But that fraternity, that sort of cost-benefit fraternity, sort of new. But alas, we were not masters of the airwaves at that time.
Yeah, so that is a very interesting background for this exact problem, right? We sort of want, as you say, this network of people inside our treasury, inside our government, inside the Prime Minister's office, and who can sort of distance themselves from the emotional side of this question and literally say who wins, who loses, what are the relative magnitudes? Are we better off, or are we just creating net losers? I do find it interesting how little airtime those people got in the public, being shouted down during COVID. But maybe we can get on to that in the context of some of the things that you wrote early on in March 2020. And this podcast will be coming out at the beginning of March 2025. Can you believe? And way back in the 18th of March, you noted that coronavirus panic probably cost us at least 10 million lives already. That was just in a matter of weeks. I think if for most people, if they had that sort of number in mind of the cost of our locking the borders, closing everyone in their homes and all that, I think we might have um, had a different sort of public vibe about it all. How do you get to such an enormous number when most people were thinking the exact opposite, that it's essentially a free
Mm-hmm.
lunch to close everything
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to save 10 million people from coronavirus? How can, like, these just numbers are so big and so
Mm-hmm.
topsy-turvy, upside down. What are the rich or deep insights that help you
Mm-hmm.
comprehend how it could be such a large number, the cost of what we did?
Well, there were two big ticket items involved in lockdowns that were sort of immediate from doing them. One is this huge economic disruption. And people tend to think that the economy and the production it generates is somehow magical and for free. But for many centuries, it was called livelihoods for a reason. Our
Mm-hmm.
lives depend on what we produce. That is still true, of course, in countries which are much less rich. But it is also true for a country like Australia, where the economy pays for taxes, taxes pay for the health system, taxes pay for good education, for roads, for police, for protection of all kinds. And so, if you disrupt the economy to a large degree and reduce the tax receipts, increase the expenditures, and so load up debt, which has to be paid back in the future, you're actually eating into your future government services. And government services are actually useful. It is useful to have a national health service with the Australian equivalents, to have a well running water system, police system, road system. And so within the cost benefit fraternity, we've sort of got rules of thumb as to how many lives government saves annually via its expenditure. And we have this around the world. And so we could figure out very early on, okay, this disruption is going to cost at least so many trillions of dollars. Those trillions of dollars will translate in reduced health services. It will translate into reduced education, less good water, less good everything. And particularly in developing countries, that is just going to cost us so many millions of people. And I hate to say it, but with hindsight, 10 million is a gross underestimate, right? I in that article already said, well, at least 10 million, but it may be a multitude more. Now we know that it's a vastly bigger number than that.
So can you maybe just clarify, these are not like 10 million people who like suddenly die because their car crashed in a pothole that wasn't repaired, and like there's this direct
Mm-hmm.
link between, oh, you didn't spend the
Mm-hmm.
money, this guy died, therefore that's one. Can you
Mm-hmm.
maybe give the case for why these statistical average effects
Mm-hmm.
are a good proxy measure? Um, and
Mm-hmm.
and that's why you get a really big number on average, even though you can't point to this one particular person. What's the best way to communicate
Yes.
that?
So let me give a couple of good examples, right? So within Australia, one of the things that happened almost immediately was the shutting down of the fertility clinics. And so that meant just that a lot of babies weren't born. And they're not going to be born later because, the fertility cycle is limited for women. And so by shutting that down, by saying, oh, we're not going to do that, that immediately cost Australia in the vicinity of a couple of tens of thousands of lives over the period of a couple of years. If you then look at a poor country, if a poor country said, okay, you're now going to spend an awful lot on coronavirus vaccines, even though your population is very young, there's almost nobody very old, and that virus is not going down. Where's that money coming from? Well, it comes at the expense of basic medicine, comes at the expense of GPs, comes at the expense of malaria nets, things like that. And so when somebody dies of malaria because, well, there was no money for the nets.
Mm,
And they won't blame, as it were, the lockdowns or the crisis, but that's how it goes. And that person wouldn't have died without the lockdowns, without the crisis, without the expenditures on things which really made no sense at all. And you can also have that in the US, of course, whereby we've seen, in the last few years, we've seen a reduction in life expectancy by about 2 years. If you work out how many lives that is, how many equivalent people that is in terms of 40-year-olds dying, 60-year-olds dying, That is, it's now been estimated between 500,000 and 1 million Americans that have essentially died as a result of that, who wouldn't have died otherwise. And they've died in a variety of ways, of diseases that otherwise they would have been immune against, or because they couldn't get operations, or because, their loneliness made them demented quicker, they died much quicker, and in a variety of other ways that wouldn't otherwise have happened. And so those are sort of the rules of thumb at play there.
Wow. So, and I guess people probably have a hard time comprehending how a small effect of people dying a year earlier, a few old guys, their body gives up earlier because they're lonely, and a few other delayed health treatments. If you multiply that by billions of people around the world, hundreds of millions in the US, hundreds of millions in Europe, billions across Asia and Africa, uh, that becomes a very big number, like an implausibly large number that you could, you know, possibly kill with one respiratory virus in a season. I just want to sidetrack, since you mentioned your first example was the delayed IVF treatments and the babies that didn't come. Two sidetracks, and I'll start with the first one. You wrote, and I'm going to go back and in August 2020. So this was, in retrospect, early on, had we lived in a different world, hopefully it would have been far past the peak of the panic, that you were worried, and other demographers and social scientists were worried about a baby bust because of postponed marriages, lack of
Hmm.
social opportunities for people to meet and form marriages. And that would be a huge future cost to that generation growing up in that period.
Hmm.
And now, 5 years later, in 2025, what's all the rage on, Elon Musk and right wing Twitter is no one's having babies anymore. But if you look at their charts, yeah, there's a declining trend. But you know what happens after 2020? It drops off a cliff, like in
Hmm.
so many places around the world. And it puzzles me that you could write in August 2020
Hmm.
with a few links to some other people that you know, and obviously in the background there are smart people thinking this. And yet here we are, 2025. No one mentions COVID when they talk about fertility decline in the last half decade. Have you noticed this, or am I
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
reading
No,
into it?
I've, I've, I've noticed exactly the same, and it is amazing, this kind of cognitive dissonance. Well, it can't be lockdowns because we did the right thing there, so that can't be the culprit, and it is sort of amazing that millions of people can be in their own rooms discussing this, and there's this big elephant right in the middle of their room, and they're not seeing it. Right, and they're scratching their heads. Yes, what could be going on? Geez, I bet it's Twitter. People are on Twitter too
Yeah.
much, and otherwise they'd be having babies, right? I mean, you could see the outlandish kind of discussions they're having,
Yeah.
but it was obvious at the start. And also, if you look at the data, do you know where the fertility climb was the biggest? Was exactly in countries where people first need to marry before they have babies, right? And so that was true in Southern Europe, where they're more religious. It was true in China, where you first marry and then you have children. That's where the fertility climb was the most dramatic, because indeed
Uh-huh.
people couldn't hitch up, they postponed their marriages, and often that means the kids won't come, right? So yeah, if you add that to the previous number, in China alone, it's probably something like 10 million kids who weren't born. You scale that up to the world level, you're talking way more of a carnage even than the Second World War. So we are, it's there's an American phrase, you're talking telephone numbers scaled up to 8 billion. The devastation has been enormous. Right?
Yeah, and even if you say, yeah, well, you can't count the cost of someone who was never born, what? So no, let me get onto that. That's going to be my next point. But even those mothers and fathers who aren't now mothers and fathers, it's a cost to them for the rest of their lives too. So even if you just want to count them and millions or tens of millions of them
Mhm.
who wanted children and never had it, and I know people who were desperate to get married and have kids before COVID, and it took years later, and now it's kind of unlikely. Maybe they're married, but they're not going to be having children now. So it's a real thing.
Totally. No, it's a real thing, and it's a devastation for millions of people, well, tens of millions living now. But I've always found it a strange argument that, preventing children from not being born doesn't count. So if I devastate someone else's fertility, I make them infertile. That's sort of okay because the lives who haven't come didn't count. I mean, if you basically make a whole people infertile, you know what that's called? That's called a genocide, right? And so we recognize that it's totally immoral to take the fertility away of people to make them infertile, but we did, and we should apply the same argument to preventing these tens of millions of people around the world if it is predictable as it was.
So just to be clear, because this comes up a lot, the you're a granny killer. If you
Hmm.
may remember, you were probably called this many times. I was called this. Our friend Gigi Foster, she probably copped it the most out of any human in Australia.
Hmm.
Um, you're sort of saying, um, to be clear, that a child's life is worth more. We should count the whole life. The cost to the
Hmm.
parent of not being a parent is a cost. Um,
Hmm.
but does that also imply that grandparents, people in their 80s who die a little earlier, are worth less because they've had their children and their lives? And is that a fair thing to do? Because I think people implicitly know this. They know it's
Hmm.
silly to go and do heart surgery on the 90-year-old when he's going to die of
Hmm.
something at the end of the year when we should have
Hmm.
done it on someone younger. We kind of know that. We know all of our older elderly relatives say, don't bother with me, it's my time. In COVID, we didn't see that. Now, can you sort of give me the rational, the economic story behind how you weight lives? Um, an 82-year-old dying from COVID versus a 22-year-old, are they different, and why?
Yeah, the standard answer there is the same answer to the question, well, who would you give a life-saving kidney to? A 20-year-old woman with 60 years of life left, or an 85-year-old with five other diseases who's going to die within 6 months anyway? And the callous answer is we all make the same choice. And furthermore, the same choice is made around the world in any reasonable health system. You give it to the young because they've got longer to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we tend to do in these cost benefit analyses is sort of count years of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you count extra years of life or lost years of life, yes, the young will matter more in those calculations, and saving them, protecting their lives, helping them, than helping the people who are close to the end of their lives anyway. That is, as it were, a happenstance of that. But I do want to challenge the people who think that they've saved grannies, right? I mean, think of what happened, right? I mean, there've been many grannies killed basically by the lockdown policies, and they were killed in three ways. One, well, they won't get grandchildren because the children have been disrupted, so their family line dies out. That is a huge burden on them, right? That disrupts their life. But more importantly, a lot of them were just locked into retirement homes and nursing homes, couldn't see their family, tied to their beds. Do you know what happens to people if they're not mentally and physically stimulated? They atrophy, they go dement very quickly, and then they die a horrible, lonely death. And that happened up and down the country. And also in Australia, this was a very prevalent thing that happened. That people don't talk about it, but in a sense, it's a horrible way of torturing old people to death. This happened on a huge scale. It's an enormous scandal. And there's a second thing that happened. I mean, in the panic of the medical profession and the governments, there was early on this sort of move, we got to ventilate people. We got to shove a ventilator down their lungs to sort of help them breathe. It now turns out that that's about one of the worst things one can do. These things are very painful. They as the data that I've seen says that 50 to 75% of the people you do that with then die because of the ventilator. But also, it's one of the worst torture mechanisms to induce death. I mean, it was an absolute horrifying thing. So if you now look at the pictures in the UK, look this person in the eye who've got these ventilators on, you're looking at a person being tortured to death, basically. And the notion that this was compassionate, that this was reasonable. No, this was blind panic. And I'm sure that when it comes to the ventilators, they probably meant well, but the effect was horrific, and it was sort of quietly, undone and is no longer done as treatment. But that's kind of the consequence of this kind of panic. Wasn't as it were looking out for granny. No, it was sort of, callously torturing many of them to death and then saying it's for their own good. And it's that kind of reality that made me very upset at the start because I could see this coming. I could see coming that in their blind panic, governments were doing totally stupid things, which were going to cost many of their own citizens, and then they were going to lie about it. They're going to pretend it didn't happen, or that well, mistakes get made. This is what happens if you panic on this kind of level. You cause huge harm, and then you spend the rest of your life covering it up, or in Australia's case, making it illegal to talk about it.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to get onto that. The fallout once we get past 2020 and how strange it was that you could see that lots of people could see ventilators were not being beneficial, those administering them, but it is a scary insight into human, compliance with authority and falling into line. And maybe I've got a genetic tendency to question everything. And my dad would always say, you're a smart guy, think for yourself. Your mate's gonna jump off a cliff, you're not gonna do it, right? And that's just a memorable thing. I'm sure it's just a genetic impulse to rebel. But but on the case, you said, ventilators were a big mistake. You wrote in 2021 the COVID congestion effects, why lockdowns actually make the transmission of respiratory viruses worse. And I remember this was funny because you wrote it in February 2021, and we're just reopening the basketball venues for my kids' basketball, and they had all these theatrics about, oh, you've got to wait outside, you've got to line up here, we've got to do all the COVID pass QR code to let you in and stuff, right? But at the end of the day, all they did was huddle us like cattle onto these little crowded sections to wait in line and all pass through the same tiny doorway in both directions. And I was sitting there thinking, like, they realize this is not actually doing anything. I realize they feel like they're doing the right thing. I understand they're covering their ass. If someone gets COVID, they go, well, we've tried everything. Even though everyone knows trying that thing made it worse. Are there any other cases you can think of besides the ventilators and the sort of bizarre queuing and cattle herding people into places where they can cough on each other while they wait, that were just perversely counterproductive to the supposed ends, but were just symbolic mechanisms? There must be more,
Oh
right?
yes. Oh yes. Oh no, there's many more. And if you ask sort of, nurses who were critical at that time, they're full of stories. So one of the stories was, well, what do you do with teams of doctors in hospital who work together on all kinds of cases and all kinds of wards if one of them might have COVID? Well, from a hospital manager point of view, these people are a liability. What did he do? Someone in the team was sniffing a little bit. Well, let's test them all, and if one of them, tests positive, the whole team has got to sit back home. And you sort of think, well, that's reasonable, isn't it? Yeah, you don't expose your patients to these people. But think of them, what happens, right? These can be large teams. They're out of action half the time. And what do you then do? You bring in a team from outside, right? And so you are actually spreading COVID through the country because you're having these sort of roaming team of doctors and nurses. And of course, by the time that you sort of swab these people, a lot of dissemination would have already taken place. And what happens? A lot of your productive capacity in the hospital is not used because you haven't got the doctors and the teams to actually man them. And so you get the remaining doctors, they're sort of overworked, right? And they get sicker all the time, right? But of course, it also means you're not actually doing life-saving operations. So you're killing people by sending all these teams home. You're actually making the disease worse because you're weakening your entire medical staff because the ones are overworked, right? And and of course, if you send back home a sick team, well, these people have got families. They're
Mm.
gonna disseminate it there. so so that was another case whereby the actual organization of sort of how does the virus transmit itself through the country. It was sort of organized via the National Health Service. They did it, by bringing in teams from other parts of the country. They were sort of spreading it around themselves. And it's a showcase of managers
Yeah.
seeming to want to do the right thing, but meanwhile making matters way worse.
Well, I think everyone's got experiences with managers seeming to do the right thing and making things worse. Um, that's definitely true. So let me tick off one more thing that was, really prevalent right at the start, which is, but what did they, 2 weeks to flatten the curve? If we just all stayed at home for 2 weeks, it would be gone. Was there ever a grain of truth to that, or was that just all nonsense? And who was calling that out if it was nonsense?
My understanding for why that came about is that this came out of the Ferguson sort of modeling, right, in the UK. But Ferguson, like most of the medics, was sort of reasonable before the whole panic. They were saying, "No, don't do this." 100 years of WHO guidelines says don't do the lockdowns. This is the established science. But the politicians basically said, "Look, we're going to do this anyway." Right? The
Mm,
politicians said, "We're going to do this anyway. Give us a scientific reason for why to do this." And then, well, somebody like Ferguson has the deep choice. He can follow his conscience to the degree he's got one, and sort of say, well, but not with my knowledge. Or he can grab the moment. He can be the man who stands next to the prime minister and says, this is the scientific reason to do it. And then they scratch their heads. Well, we've got these complicated models for virus transmission and reducing. Can I come up with some possible constellation of assumed parameters, assumed ways in which the world works, in which they might be useful, right? And then they play around with their R0 and this and that, and they come up with something which just works in their model world, right? Which
mm,
has very little bearing on reality as it is, right? And then these things are there in a curve, right? And these things have nothing to do with reality. There's waves of flu and sort of colds have not been stopped by any of this in the past, right? So it's sort of, totally fantastical. But, this made him millions. He became a
yeah.
sexy household name. These are nerds who are suddenly in the limelight and have, young women writing them love letters. I mean, from his point of view, this was probably the best day of his life.
Oh my God. I hate to be cynical, but I see people succumb to that temptation of just, I'll tweak my model a bit to say the right answer to get the popular answer. That's definitely true. And I guess I think we've had conversations before about the modeling of viruses and the reality of them, and there was a lot of everyone suddenly became an expert at these models, right, where there's one pulse, everyone eventually gets the virus and then everyone's immune. Like, it's pretty naive, simple approach, but that's not really how things work in reality. It's more of an evolutionary story, and things get saturated, and then you have legacy immunity from the virus 2 years ago that was slightly different, and it's quite a different story. One of the I think topics. So I want to sort of shift more now into the sort of details of what COVID was and what we could have known if we're making these considered, judgments about this relative size and cost of benefits. We sort of covered, the lockdowns, delaying hospital services, destroying economic activity comes with just astronomical costs because everything's multiplied by, the size of the economy. On the COVID side, um, there was a lot of fear, but we could have known stuff early on. Um, and let me start maybe with the Diamond Princess, and I'm not sure if you remember that. Was the
Yeah,
Diamond
totally. I wrote about it.
Princess? Was it a lesson in how lethal and deadly COVID was, which I think everyone thought that was the lesson, or was it the lesson in how mundane and normal it was compared to other flu seasons, for example?
It
Do you
was totally
recall
the
that?
latter, right? So the Diamond Princess was a ship on which COVID was discovered, and the authorities decided to sort of lock it down until nobody was ill anymore. And out of the about 3,700 people on board, who were pretty much all geriatrics apart from the crew, because old people are people who go on cruises, it's only 8 people who died, and then but 8 people within a few months, few weeks of 4,000 elderly people. That is sort of a normal death rate for that kind of population. and they were attributed to COVID, but even 8 out of 4,000, well, that ain't all that much, right? That is what, a quarter of a percent, right? So that was an IFR of zero point 0.2, but which is very normal for basically any flu going around in various years. So that makes it a normal flu. But this is also where nerds get going, right? So nerds get going, and you can almost see them thinking, well, okay, how do I wangle, 4 out of 4,000 into a horrible number? Well, you know what? I'm going to pretend that I don't know that. Of course, everybody on that ship will have been exposed, right? Because they're all dancing together and this and that for
Yeah.
for days and weeks. I'm going to pretend the only people exposed were those who were still positive in a test. And the thing to know about
Mm.
COVID is that many people, it never gets into the bloodstream. It's sort of immediately fought off by hemoglobin and other parts of the skin and the mucus. And so let's pretend only the people who tested positive are actually exposed, right? Well,
Yeah.
that gets you up to 1% then, right? And then you say, okay, well, how about people who died later on? Let's pretend it was not because, well, they were old and had other diseases. We're going to add those, right? So no, it wasn't eight. If I look a year later, how many died of 4,000 old people? Well, rather a lot, right? And so you can sort of see the nerds getting going, right? And then, of course, the population, the politicians have got no clue about these kind of assumptions. It's on page 15 in a footnote, and they have no idea what that means. But of course, the scientific advisor, he's making his career. This is, a, a career-defining hooray moment in which, he stands next to very important and very rich people and sort of gets to do their bidding. So you can just see how this the lure of power and fame sort of sucks in these supposed objective professionals into sort of total quackery.
It was quite amazing how for so long after people who I thought were could be objectively reasonable on these types of social questions would still tell me how horrific it was that 8 people in 3 months or 90 days died out of a population with an average age of 84 or something. Like, I mean, it was probably not 84, it was probably 74, but you know what I mean? Like, they don't actually realize that you've got a 10% of dying every single year once you get to that age. Like, in 3 months, you should have 3% of people dying, or 2.5% of people. And for some reason that was impenetrable to their mind. I mean, they're ruled by these deeper emotions. So I'll quickly pick up. You said, hiding things on footnote on page 15. A good friend of mine, Aidan Morrison, is, unpicking a lot of the energy debate in Australia, and in the Senate inquiry. Someone mentioned, I'm not an expert. I'm a trained physicist and this and that, but probably my main skill is reading past the executive summary and often reading the footnotes. And once you've done that, you know everything. and I don't know. It just shocks me that's uncommon. I don't know if it was, the PhD experience, our conversations, the way we've both sort of engage in research. We actually want to know the answer. That's you can literally jump straight to those footnotes. I don't know if you told me once when you're reading a paper, you're like, oh, skip that. That's just all marketing. Go to the data, go to the methods, go to the footnotes, just go straight into that, because they're not going to hide their assumptions in the executive summary. Like, come on. Anyway, that's just a story.
I think you were already skeptical before we met, Cameron.
Oh, well, it was some kind of like fuel for that you provided, that's for sure.
Good.
So one thing we have spoken about in the past is the mental model people had of the dangers of the virus versus other health threats at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
the idea of this immune deficit. And I know you're like, well, you have to
Mm-hmm.
train your immune system, you have to train your brain, you have to train
Mm-hmm.
your body, right? If you lock yourself away from everyone for a year, you're going to get sick as soon as you leave, because
Mm-hmm.
just like if you don't walk for a year, you're going to not be able to walk. Why wasn't that in the debate? I think I had that conversation with you. I think my dad was,
Mm-hmm.
a bit of a believer of that story to some degree, but not that many people, given the whole point of this was to lock people away and let their immune
Yeah, yeah,
systems essentially have a nice big
I know.
rest.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
that true? Like, is that true? Is it an old wives' tale? You know, everyone's like, "Oh, kids have to eat more dirt these days and stuff." I'm like, "Yeah, that's
Hmm.
good," but then it's true for everyone. You can't just lock old people away and expect them not to catch the next bug. Is that right?
Oh,
Like,
exactly. And it's and I mean, it underscores, the power of panic and the power of groupthink. Because right up until March 2020, the Australian health fraternity, the UK health fraternity was banging the drum for years about old people should be exercising, they should be outside, they should be socializing. There was a whole anti-loneliness drive. There was a drive to sort of create community for people to take charge and indeed be exposed to all kinds of pathogens, to have their immune system have a bit of a workout, right? The thing with the immune system, it needs a bit of a workout, but not too much, right? It's like a muscle. Bit of a workout is good. Too much, it sort of tears off and you got a problem. And that was sort of accepted wisdom for a century. And within the space of 1 or 2 weeks, the exact same health professionals who have been writing pamphlets about, have sunshine, have vitamin D,
yeah,
exercise, socialize, were suddenly writing pamphlets about, stay home, save lives. And it was kind of like an instant lobotomy. It's kind of like they forgot everything they were ever trained, forgot everything they've been working towards that they saw as the truth, and they just flipped because the new narrative was a totally different way of viewing reality, which is that somehow there's this evil werewolf out there called corona, and if only you lock yourself in, you'll avoid it. Well, it's a virus. It ain't a werewolf. And all you're doing is you're weakening yourself inside your home. And you're actually more likely to pick it up there anyway, because, you're in ventilation with many others. And of course, you still got to go out to the supermarket, otherwise known as the COVID distribution center, where, you're going to pick it up anyway. I mean, in modern society, you can't, as it were, siphon yourself off and live somewhere else. So it was also an amazing experience to see all these supposed professionals becoming babbling idiots overnight almost on the exact same thing on which they were sort of true reasonable experts just a few days before. I saw this happen with people, and it was kind of like, wow, right? I mean, I'd read about that in sociology. I'd read that this was possible, but I'd never seen it up close with friends who talked it was like watching them turn into babbling buffoons, sort of overnight, as the fear gripped them, and they sort of went on to a stampede. Right? It was absolutely astonishing to witness.
I couldn't believe it. It's sort of I always thought the media was, a bit of fear mongering, a bit of vested interest, a bit of that. And now I really see it as a really nefarious sort of tool for these sort of, I thought it was relatively weak. You know, a vested interest gets
Mm-hmm.
up on there. Eventually people are like, yeah, he's talking his book. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't know. There are situations where that is very powerful. Now, I want to definitely get on to the crowd phenomena and the crisis of expertise and the fallout since then. But I guess the last point on the actual, experience of living through this is to talk about the vaccines and the and similar things happened. It was I'll never take the Trump vaccine because it was the Trump. Oh, I've lost your sound.
Well, I'm good.
Okay. So a lot of people said, oh, "I'll never take the Trump vaccine." It's a rushed thing. It's this whatever his thing was, Project Turbocharged vaccine. I don't even remember the name.
Mm-hmm.
It's not important. What's important is everyone changed their mind and said, "I won't take
Light
it. It's
speed.
risky. It's rushed." And then as soon as it became the Biden vaccine, all of a sudden, oh, when are we going to vaccinate all the babies and the kids? And I was, abused on live television by the head of the Australian Medical Association for saying we don't need to rush to vaccinate children because we already know their risk is so low, but we don't know their risk is low for the vaccine. We can open up anytime we want. And, I got a lot of private support by email, but the president of the AMA had to pick it up with me on, live TV and tell me how much of an idiot I was. And then some other academic had to tell me how economists don't know anything. But then over beers in the green room afterwards, head of the AMA is like, oh, yeah, yeah, no, we don't really know that. And I've read those studies. It's very uncertain. And I'm like, how irresponsible is it for you to get on Australian television and say
Hmm.
the line you've been told by your institution and not what you genuinely believe or understand about the balance of risks. Anyway, so I thought we'd better get on to that. Is that how did you see that early on? Did you see risks either way? Because in my mind, it was coronavirus, super low risk. They're giving this thing to millions of people, this vaccine. I don't see people dropping dead in the street either. That must also be low risk. It's two super low risks. Who cares?
Hmm.
Like my life compared to all the other risks I'm taking, running across the street, doing stupid things, getting drunk, uh, and messing around with the boys. Like it's too low to worry about. Is that right? Or how would you
Hmm.
know, based on your expertise early on, how to approach those more unknown risks after we've had that year of COVID?
I mean, the vaccines were an interesting thing, right? Because we've learned more over time what happened to them. And I mean, early in 2021, I was a little bit agnostic about the vaccines for older people, right? I felt they were a poor idea for anybody below 50 because, well, they didn't sort of run any major risks anyway in the scheme of things. As you said, getting in the car is more dangerous. And we do that on a daily basis. But for 80-year-olds, particularly for 80-year-olds with a couple of underlying conditions, whereby if you caught this virus, it would have been particularly bad. I was convinced that there was some protection given by these vaccines. Well, okay, if you do it on a voluntary basis, that would be fine, right? Um, but of course, it became more and more mandated, right? There was this strange story out there that these were wonderful vaccines, but nevertheless, people who didn't want it needed to get it to protect the ones who had it. And then it was kind of
Yeah,
like, well, if
exactly.
you've got this wonderful vaccine, why does somebody else then need to take it as well, right? So that was sort of a crowd phenomenon. But it was also pushed by the manufacturers, of course, who were eager to sell more of their product, and by these medical people who were sort of, well, this sort of proves how important it is because everybody must have it. And of course, doctors got kickbacks and commissions of putting these needles in arms, right? So you're also, yeah, you're basically talking about arsonists leading the fire department,
Yeah,
saying, well, everybody
of
must have an
course.
arson, so I can sort of go and close it. So there was economic incentives there as well, and that became clear to me over time, both how dangerous the vaccines were, and I think even the manufacturers didn't know that at at
Really.
that
Yeah.
early level, but they might have. They might have. I mean, they trials. There was data hidden. There was data, or perhaps deliberately misinterpreted. I mean, there were the geeks who might have known, but it became clear over time just how bad all the side effects were and how prevalent. And of course, it's an absolute crime to force these onto young kids. I mean, that is one of the worst things.
Yeah, I think if you're going to take risks, right? Yeah, the voluntary nature of it, and just knowing the relativities. Like one thing I've learned since
Hmm.
coronavirus, people don't understand the difference between 1,000, a million, or a billion. It's just if it's bigger than
Hmm.
10, it's a big number, and if it's not, I can handle it in my head. So if you go, well, the risks for a teenager are 3,000 times lower than the risk for a 75-year-old, they're like, yeah, that's a little bit lower. I'm like, no, it's not a little bit lower. It's like
Exactly.
imperceptible, right? They just couldn't get it. Like, oh, but it's still a risk, right? I'm like, it's not binary. Like, yeah, just like an ant is an animal and a blue whale is an animal. They're both animals. Are you going to stomp? What are you going to
Yep.
stomp on, right? Like, I
I
found
know,
it
I know. The
bizarre.
mathematical illiteracy is a case in point, but this also turned out for most supposed professors of economics, for most professors of medicine, they were sort of been shown, via these is a similar kind of reasoning to sort of be mathematically illiterate. It is apparently very, very difficult for humans to really latch onto a number like 1 in a million and really, as it were,
Mm,
keep in mind that that is much less than 1 in 30, right? And that 1 in a million is that's a snake bite and it doesn't prevent you from going outside. And 1 in 30, well, okay, that's going with a gun into a gunfight. That is a totally different kettle of fish.
yeah. No, I just and it was probably it was almost worse to see that otherwise, statistically literate people revert back to this binary thinking. Well, it's still a risk. I'm like, but
Hmm.
that's not how it
Hmm.
works. Like everything is a risk, right? Like that's not how
Hmm.
it works. Anyway, Look, I'll
I mean,
definitely release.
but it's well, no, it's good to talk about that because I mean the way that works is that essentially for people a risk is something they see and something that they see others being afraid of. And so the
Uh-huh.
way that people weigh a risk or as important it is just a matter of how much it's on the media, how much they see other people being afraid. That's it. And the number of people who can hold a number in their head and see all their friends panicking and see their entire society panicking and nevertheless not panic themselves because no, no, guys, it's one in a million. That is so rare. That is rare among scientists. That's rare among politicians. That is just a very, very rare thing to be able to sort of not be infected by the emotions of a group. That is, and I think that's always been rare. I don't think we'll unlearn that as a species. We'll always be affected by what everybody else feels and thinks.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, that's probably a good time to move on. I'll definitely be talking more about the vaccine fallout later this year to what I'm calling the crisis of expertise and how our experts became part of this swept up in the crowd phenomenon. It's like imagine, the statistician for the, NBA in the crowd recording their thing, and then the crowd starts, booing, and then all of a sudden they get swept up in it. I'm like, you're just the statistician, just do your job, right? Like you don't have to do what the crowd's doing. Is it your view? I'm genuinely curious because I think it's my view that COVID was the end or a huge um, wake up call, at least the end of COVID when most people stopped panicking about uh, our experts and how little we can trust them and know them and how easily they'll just sway in the political breeze and go with what's popular? Or do you think this is just kind of there's a background amount of incompetence in every society in all institutions, and this was a kind of big sort of special crowd phenomenon for its intensity? Um, because I sort of see things even like, the Trump election, Brexit, recent things like this as part of this process of people having enough of these know-it-all experts who are missing these obvious things. Like, as you say, the Diamond Princess was
Mm-hmm.
obvious. The immune system needs exercising. That's obvious. People are not going to have kids. That's obvious.
Yeah.
Or do you think I'm just reading into trying to find a grand narrative that's not there, and we're just all muddling
No, no,
through
no,
as
no, no,
usual?
no, no, no. I mean, where I totally agree with you is that we've become, as it were, I won't say an expert-led society because I think the leadership is more on the politicians, more on the vested interest, the super rich, people with an obvious own agenda, which is very understandable. Their power,
Hmm.
their wealth, their fame, and that the journalists and the scientists, they're way down the stream. They're not leading this. They sort of get funds from particular things, and they too get swayed by the media. So I do think that we're in a society whereby the experts are front and center, but they're not really driving the show. And there is an awful lot of bullshittery among experts. And there is an awful lot of fake expertise. And everybody has their favorite expert to argue what is really their back
Yeah.
pockets. Right? And so I think that the crisis there is of quite enormous, staggering bullshit industry, right? And the size of which I basically think the Twitter number is right? Where Musk came in, he sacked 70 to 80%, and Twitter functioned better. Well, that tells you 70 to 80% were probably bullshitters. And I think that's now the reality inside most of our large organizations. I think that's about the right number for universities, that's the right number for large corporations. I think that's the right number for government. I think that bullshit industry is so huge and so many people make their jobs with it, pretending to have expertise or being the expert who just says whatever power wants them to say. That yeah, there's a crisis of that, but it's an understandable crisis because everybody likes to have the scientific report arguing their point of view, and this is also just
Mm,
how the rich fight their battles. So, and that is a deeper problem. That is pre-corona. It exists post-corona. That'll keep on going, and that crisis is not easily solved. And good luck on Musk trying to sort that out with the U.S. government. But I
yeah.
think to come back to your earlier point, is it possible to have true experts, as it were, who remain calm under fire? I'm a bit more pessimistic on that. I
Mm.
think that if there's a true stampede going, that practically everybody runs along with the stampede. And that it
Mm.
doesn't matter what expertise you have, it doesn't matter what prior education you're given or how independent a thinker you think you are. I think that's the nature of humanity. We are herd animals. If the rest of our herd stampedes, our natural reaction, no matter what it is hang on, I'm coming. And then
Yep.
we remain the expert within that. So I'm more pessimistic. In that sense, humanity doesn't have an individual protection against being stampeding animals. If we have a protection on that, we should seek it more in systems. Systems of divisions of power,
Mm.
or moving against these kind of herd phenomena by very quickly doing almost a counter propaganda, or just having different countries with totally different points of view going their own way whilst there is a stampede, and then people more quickly figuring out, oh, you know what, Tanzania, that
Yeah.
guy just ridiculed COVID by sort of testing a papaya and a goat positive on national television. The whole country laughed and they were over it, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the wisdom there is more in having lots of different places who do different things, so the rest snaps out of it quickly. But I don't think individuals can be given a protection against going along with the herd. I don't know that that's possible.
No, I'm like, I actually feel like I've trained myself enough to feel the sensation of wanting to like join the crowd. I'm just like, oh yeah, hang on. Oh, it feels good. It's all right. Let's go. Like, I, but I'm sure, in most local circumstances, when all my mates are there, a good mate of mine once said, if we go to war, you're going to go. You're not going to stand on principle and say it's unjust because all your mates will be there and we'll be like, fine. And you'll be like, well, all my mates are there anyway. I may as well go. And I think that was pretty insightful for considering we were probably like 15 or 16 at the time having that conversation. So
Yeah,
um I'll give you before we get on to looking from the future and changing these systems. One other random thing that popped up recently about this crisis of expertise was the Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme. It came across my
mm-hmm.
radar because I was looking for a lot of like public policy failures, and that was forecast to be 3 billion a year. Then it was forecast to be 8 billion, then 12 billion. And you wrote, nearly a decade ago, 9 years ago, um, on Club Troppo in response to Nicholas Gruen's article, you're just like, no one has been able to explain this to me. Here's some obvious points where it's going to get scammed and rorted. If you can't offer any further explanation, I see no reason essentially that that's not going to all fall to pieces. And of course, now it's going to cost whatever 48 billion this year, and it's completely out of control beast with scams on many fronts, both on qualifying as disabled and also providing services. The service providers. Why is it that this multi-billion-dollar policy, hundreds of billions now over the last 9 years since you wrote that, how is it that all the other experts sort of trusted, oh, it'll be fine because it feels like the right thing to do, and just a handful of people, and you were one of them, were like, this is going to get rorted on all these it's like it's obvious from the start. Why? How? What sort of failure does that indicate of the sort of these institutions we trust to nut these things out and think it through before we go paying these bills?
Well, I think that the NDIS debacle would have been avoided in a better functioning bureaucracy, right? I think that the Australia of 1996 would not have been so stupid, but the Australia of
Oh,
2016, its bureaucracy was, right? And you and I had already written our book on corruption, rigged, and game of mates. And we already knew that the public service was hollowed out, a lot of its expertise was gone, and a lot of room was made within these departments for an awful lot of corruption and rorting. And so it was sort of set up to be stupid. It was sort of set up not to think, whereas previously there was a lot more intelligence in the public service and a lot more systems which spotted these things and prevented them from becoming so dominant. And you and I knew that they had been dismantled. You and I knew that it was sort of open slather for the corrupt within the Australian public service. And this was sort of, backed by, all these kind of fake think tanks and bought media. And so you and I already knew that that was the case. And here was this huge program with all this discretion, all this, these case managers who could make any argument for their supposed clients as to how much they needed, of which they could then give a kickback and they could
Yeah.
organize, of course, who was going to give these services. And so it was totally obvious. Oh my God, this is basically open slather on a huge amount of tax receipts of the government. Of course, this is going to be an enormous train wreck. And then we could already see the marketing, the sort of the one disabled person who hasn't got enough services trotted out on television, does a tearful story. We could see the manipulation. And we were sort of, well, here we go again. And people shouted down who were being reasonable, who sort of said, well, there's an awful lot of people with some disability out there, and they could claim a huge amount of money. This would basically mean we have no education, other health service, or any other service in the country if we truly give everybody everything they want. Standard economic arguments. And they were shouted down, which is an indication that the rotors were already on the way. They were sort of with gleams in their eyes. They were sort of thinking, "Oh my God, this is going to be another bonanza." My second holiday home in Ibiza, here I come. Right.
Yeah. I just, it baffles me. And that, the basic economic thing of you can't, like, some person who gets rewarded for diagnosing someone with something, who gets a kickback when the government pays for something, is the person who makes all these decisions. Like there's kind of like economics 101 incentives there that
Mm-hmm.
someone else should do that, you do that, like separate the powers, as you mentioned earlier, in the institutions, so that, yeah, if you want that $5,000 new van, or home renovation for your kid who's walking okay but maybe has some minor disability, well, you've got to get the incentives right. And I would often say, if you offered to pay the person half the amount that it costs to not never come back and make a claim, people would just take the cash. I'm sure of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that already shows
Yeah.
you 50% is just compute pure nothing. That it's worth more for
Mm-hmm.
the people that have the cash and deal with it themselves. Anyway, I just find it mind blowing that for 20 years everyone was worried about the age pension and aging population, and then within 5 or 6 years the NDIS blows the age pension out of the water. It's not doing any. The function of the age pension is quite good, right? Like, because it's got an income
Mm-hmm.
test. It's only targeted at the elderly. It does its job really well, dollar for dollar, and it's now cheaper than the NDIS. And I don't think people really understand the scale. You know, a mate of mine
Oh
online is
wow.
now measuring policy debacles and wastes in fractions of a year NDIS. And some people go,
Mm-hmm.
"This is the biggest waste I've ever seen." You can't just spend 100 million here or a billion there. He's like, 0.1% of 1 year's NDIS. Get your priorities right. so to get
Classic.
So you just said you're a little bit pessimistic on people not going with the crowd and focusing on systems. So um, to sort of wrap up our conversation, for people who don't know, Paul, you're running Libramentis, Academia Libramentis, the Academy of
Mm-hmm.
Free Minds in Belgium, in a town that I
Mm-hmm.
can't pronounce, but I think it's Thu. Is that right?
Hot Beaumont. Castle Hot Beaumont.
Yeah, Castle Hobdemont, and the town near you is called Two or something
So
weird.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Two in my Aussie accent. What is this all about? Is this a contribution to training young thinkers? How do you see it fitting? Is your one of your objectives to sort of foster the education of experts to to sort of be more free thinking, more analytical, and less maybe crowd focused? Or tell me about it, because I know the Australian for Science and Freedom that Gigi Foster runs here is very much sort of nurturing those types of thinkers. What's happening in
Mhm.
Belgium?
Yes, this is a joint enterprise very much with Professor Gigi Foster and with the Australians for Science and Freedom, of which I'm also a co-founder. Um, we indeed have bought a castle in the Ardennes, Belgium. We're on to our second year of programs. liberamentis.org. I hope Cameron will somewhere put it, as it were, where you can actually go check it out. We have a summer program for 3 months, June, July, August. So come for 3 months. That's very easy to organize in terms of your visa. What is it for? It's indeed for people who want to develop their own thinking, who sort of also want to understand how whole systems work, with some view of wanting to help reform them or lead them or set up their own business and survive in sort of the reality of today. But it's very much about helping people develop their own worldview, as we call it, so that
Uh-huh.
people themselves get an idea for, okay, I think this is how it works, and okay, I've been given these, as it were, seeding ideas and this knowledge of statistics and how to present and how to write and how to sort of get information out of conversations. And I've lived together with others for 3 years at this wonderful castle. I've got new friends, and I actually now know how to make my own dinner and sort of what it is to sort of walk and run outside. But also, okay, I'm going to take that and mull over it, but I'm going to develop things myself. I'm going to add some ideas which were sort of maybe a bit more deeper in this area, what I've learned, and we're going to add some language skills. Now I'm going to set up businesses. That's been our experience, and that's our hope. So for, as it were, the sort of entrepreneurial maverick smart, you got to be able to handle numbers. Thinkers out there, this is an ideal preparation for the rest of your life. So the 3 month program, we call it Unleash Your Curiosity. So it's very much about almost starting to discover how much there already is in your brain and what its true potential is, right? What its true potential is if it applies itself, if it gets exposed to a lot of knowledge of sort of economics, history, biology, neuroscience, health sciences, psychology, and also these sort of core scientific skills. How do I run a survey? How do I actually make a prediction? How do I check my prediction?
Mm.
To become a real self thinker. That's what it's for. And we've got a whole year program for those who are really sort of, committed to becoming a reformist leader. And that starts in September to September. Then you sort of, you will come out a different person. Let me guarantee you.
And if I recall, you also deal a lot with this, um, thinking about health and society and weighing up things in the systems,
Hmm.
like we've talked about,
Hmm.
and how we should have
Yep.
known early on that it's implicit
Hmm.
that the elderly life is worth less, or from a system
Hmm.
perspective, you should spend your resources on the young person, right? Um,
Hmm.
because yeah, health economics is definitely one of your areas, and I think in the post-COVID era, I think a lot of people are much more interested in that and maybe skeptical about many of the things they're hearing. So I'll definitely put some links and everything on the podcast. Is there anything else we've skipped over on our reflection of 5 years of COVID craziness? Maybe I really wanted to ask you. I was going to ask you earlier. In 50 years' time, you actually wrote, um, how will historians view the COVID period? Has what was your view when you first wrote that? Oh, to in November 2020, you wrote it still in 2020. You were thinking, what will people think of us in 50 years? What did you think then, and what do you think now, 5 years after the Corona panic debacle?
Well, I was trying to peer into the crystal ball of the future, which is always difficult, right? And I mean, you can never do much better than guess. And so to hedge my bets a bit, I sort of laid out three possible predictions, right? So I said, well, okay, we could sort of come to our senses, pretend it didn't happen, and sort of return to the status quo. And that's usually what happens with most crises. So that was one prediction. The second prediction was, well, effectively the medical fascists and their corporate backers will win and will keep doing this, right? We'll year
Mm.
after year lockdowns and these medicines, we'll give them Nobel Prizes and we'll sort of mandate this and we'll set up an industrial machinery. Well, that sort of also happened. They have been given Nobel Prizes. The WHO has set this up together with, the Germans and previously the Americans into an industrial machinery, which sort of dare to fleece us forevermore and make us less healthy. But that does not look like winning. Now that the Americans have taken a different route, I do think that that scenario is now long run off the table. And so then the third scenario was the huge backlash, the backlash which would lead into a more nationalistic, patriotic era whereby populations will once again discover that they have agency, they can take charge of themselves, and that they have at their elite and their political level a lot of people who don't work for their best interest, and that you will get a real backlash. You will see political parties who are there more for your own interest as a people's, and that you will see real thinking about how can we reform our institutions, and how can we have better health for less money.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit optimistic now. I think in 50 years' time, this period will be seen as one of the worst medical mistakes in history, if not the worst medical mistake in history. I do think in 50 years' time that'll be the consensus, that'll be the textbooks that young students will learn. And also that it was sort of the starting shot of sort of getting rid of the bullshit industry, at least for a while, and
Mm.
of a rediscovery of sort of national consciousness, national identity. And I think that in a sense we're only at the start of that. The corporatist, the bullshit industry is still very strong. It's totally dominant in Australia. I mean, there's hardly a political party in Australia which is not part of that conglomerate and which does not rule the roost. And so I think Australia is really only at the very early days of that backlash. But I do see it coming, and and I think the Trump phenomenon is part of that. But of course, he's also part of the corporatist. He just part of a different group of them, if you like.
Mm.
But I think that is the starting gun of really a quite major change in our society, probably in the long run for the better, and that will be remembered as such. But of course, in 50 years' time, there'll have been all kinds of other things which may well overshadow all of this. The AI
Yeah.
stuff can overshadow it, and wars can overshadow it. So in 50 years' time, I doubt they'll still be busy with this period, but as it will then be written, I do think the medical mistake will be owned up to by the historians, and that it will be seen as the start of sort of a more patriotic and sort of citizen heavy era.
Yeah, that's sort of my impression in general too. I think it's just so hard to ignore all the charts and all the data being collected on health and the economy. You can't ignore it, right? And anyone for the
Mm-hmm.
next 4.5 decades looking at this period will see these massive adjustments, massive declines in GDP, like, Australia, Canada, quite a few countries. GDP per capita is the same in 2025 in Canada as it was in 2015. And most of that's the
Mm-hmm.
COVID era and the post-COVID sort of failure to rebound. So I think everyone who's analyzing data for the next 45 years cannot ignore this. So I think,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, eventually we're going to have to see it in the context of this huge, costly mistake that cost tens of millions of lives, as you said. And yeah, I really hope there's some uh, degree of positive change in terms of people's agency, voting for change, being active, and realizing how much is bullshit and that
Yeah.
we can do things differently.
Essentially, but I first think, particularly in Australia, it will get way worse. Because
Mm.
I mean, the not only is the economy now at the same level it was a long, long time ago, but of course it's become way more unequal. So for the vast majority of the population, they're a lot poorer now than they used to be. Youngsters can no longer afford homes, whereas a generation ago they could. And that'll has devastating consequences. And don't forget, whole population has had these school lockdowns, so they're going to come through the system much less well educated, much less well adjusted. And via the social media and the internet, of course, lots of people are just stuck in their distractions and are still not really busy taking ownership of their lives or seeing themselves as protectors of their society. So I think Australia is in for a very rough ride in years to come. And you know what the elites are doing? They're opening the borders, letting huge numbers of migrants, and their hope is that Australia will basically have very few Australians in them in 50 years' time, right? At least not people with the same mindset as now, that they'll hence ride that backlash by effectively
Dilution.
making it a totally different culture and population.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I feel like there's going to be pushback against that? I mean, in Canada, there's been some pushback and they've cut down student stuff. The US, obviously, Trump election was a huge pushback. Is Europe in front or behind Australia, do you think?
I think in front because it's in the key countries that matter, Germany and France and England, it's pretty bad. The poverty there is way worse than it's been for a generation. In the data
Wow.
that I see, health is far worse, but also the political backlash is far further. You now have political parties which get maybe up to 30% of the electoral votes. And of course, the dominant political parties, they depict them as, new Nazis and fascists and this and that. They're basically accusing them of what they themselves are.
Mm.
But that's a lot of people, right? And there's a lot of power behind that, particularly as in America from the industrialists, the people who want to produce things,
Yeah.
because they want a well-educated, stable population. They sort of, want and are committed via their production facilities to be around for a long, long time. They're not, as it were, the fleeting billionaires on the internet who could move tomorrow. They're deeply embedded in their societies. So the
Yeah.
industrialists and the more patriotic elements are combining in various
Ah.
countries. And so they're forming a power block. And the anger is rising and rising in Germany and France and the UK. And so there, the backlash is years ahead of Australia. But of course, the sort of the totalitarian propaganda censorious complex here is very strong as well, right? Via the EU, via the corporations and their stranglehold on the media. Things in that sense are way worse, but also the backlash is way
Yeah, yeah. So
stronger.
you're
So
ahead
in that sense,
chronologically.
we're years
Yeah.
ahead. Sorry? Yeah,
Yes, you're ahead chronologically. You're
yeah.
yeah, but the backlash is far ahead because the censorship is further ahead, whereas Australia's just sort of gearing up the censorship bandwagon now. We just passed one law. We got rid of one that was proposed last year. But yeah, no, it's going to be interesting times, and I think people won't admit that the COVID response, the COVID policy, the COVID panic was a critical part of what we're seeing now politically. Do you think it
Mhm.
is? Because I think it is, and I think
Oh,
people
it's
don't want to
totally a
admit it.
critical part. I think in the long run, in a sense, in the COVID period, the globalists saw their chance at sort of trying to take the reins of power in the West, via the World Health Organization, via these sort of mandated lockdowns and vaccines and all the benefits that came with that to them. And I think they overplayed their hands.
Mm,
The deeper reality of our societies is that we are still countries. We have a national identity. And Australians are behind in the backlash because they're so rich. It's such a great
mm.
place to be. There is it takes a while for a lot of that to be taken away for the population to sort of wake up. But it is a slumbering dragon in Australia. I mean, Australia does have underlying good institutions that allow for political change. Your democracy, its underlying structure is pretty good, and so you can much more quickly than Europe actually turn things around once the Australians get going. And the Europeans, it's much harder to turn things around, even if the population gets going. But in Australia, it can turn around much, much quicker. And so, in that sense, I'm hopeful for the Australians that their suffering doesn't have to be as long as it will have to be in Australia for real
Yeah.
change.
Well, I mean, Australia's just copies what America does anyway. Like we
Exactly.
import so much culture that when you guys get to the other side, we'll just skip all the bad part and just come with you. There's my optimistic way to finish. Like we'll just sort of
The lucky
let it
country,
go.
eh?
Yeah, yeah, the lucky country, mate. I love that phrase because it's so true. We're often ruled by idiots, but by pure coincidence, because we follow the world so much, other people make stupid mistakes first and get to the other side before we've even, got our socks on in the morning. So
Yes, but Australia also has a proud history of leading the West, right? If you ask, well, in which region was there female suffrage first? Well, that was in New Zealand, Australia. The sort of the parliamentary democracy, everybody votes. That was in Australia before Europe. Right. So, and also you've got some real innovations via the method of your voting. Everybody has to vote. I
Yeah.
think that's a great institution. That means everybody sort of is locked into the system. No, no, and Australia in that sense has led the world, but it was a century ago, but still, one should,
Look,
be
I, I
proud.
just I just caught up with a mate. Shout out to Alistair if you're reading, who's or listening, who's working in the UK, an Aussie, and he came here. He's like, everything works so well here in the UK. Like he's like, oh, I broke my wrist, had to go to the doctor and stuff. He's like, it was drama here. Yeah, I had to pay like $20, but got seen instantly. The tests were done instantly. Um, he said everything here that he's encountered in the 3 weeks he's been back just works so much better. And I just thought, oh, well, that's nice. I do appreciate that. So there must be competent people in the kind of service delivery part of our institutions and
Exactly.
and I
Yeah.
feel like, yeah, if such people can sort of be empowered and less politically interfered with,
Hmm.
that's probably a very good thing. But we do need a way to manage these political
Hmm.
whims and crowds, etc. So on that positive note about Australia, with a little bit of negative and
Aussie, Aussie,
concern,
Aussie.
we might have to wrap it up, Paul. And I will direct everybody listening to some of your old articles and predictions, but most importantly, Libera Mentis, your new academy for thinkers in Belgium, for anyone who wants to either come over for 3 months for the indulge your curiosity course and see what's happening there. I can vouch for the fact you'll meet a lot of interesting people and have your mind tested and challenged. As someone who was Paul's student 10 years ago, and be a better person at the end. So I appreciate your time and reminiscing about much of the bad and of COVID. But I hope history, sorts out this period, and there are some long-term lessons from those people who could think independently. So thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you very much, Cameron, and well done on this podcast series. Great to see it thrive. Bye,
Thanks so much.
everybody.